of religious freedom is protected in the United States. And, not to get too into the weeds on it, but up until a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton just a couple of years back, the praying football coach, do you remember this guy?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Up until then, at least on the books, there was a case which controlled how the courts interpreted Establishment Clause issues. And it was an approach which allowed the courts to say, no, this goes too far into the area of breaking down that wall of separation between church and state. Well, in Kennedy versus Bremerton, that test was swept away. And in its place, there's a new way of approaching Establishment Clause issues, which really has been an invitation to those in the states who want to push the Establishment Clause restraints as far as possible and see how far they can push it before it will break. And so that is why, Andre, we are seeing a more recent rash in these legislative initiatives at the state level, which are attacking, our this constitutional principle of separation of church and state.
Orlin.
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue in terms of the idea, as we were talking about, that you think you have a friendly court that may be at the end, that if you can try to get as much in the pipeline as possible on the front end, hoping that you'll get to that end decision that you're looking for, is where we see a lot of the activities happening. One of the things that's been kind of interesting is, this concept of stare decisis in the law, which generally used to mean that you could have rules, you could have regulations, but unless you had a specific case in which you needed to go to court with it, you really didn't end up kind of like dealing with the issue. Well, now we're seeing the courts really starting to take on matters, and you may not even have a specific case to take it on. So it becomes almost a policy battle that takes place where you don't even have a specific set of facts that you're kind of going with in order to come to a decision, which sometimes causes the court to be accused of being more of an activist operation as opposed to one that's kind of just ruling on what comes before it. And so I think all of that has caused a lot of the confusions that we see. And then the reality is from an Adventist perspective, we are not a monolithic group of thinkers as it relates to politics and in a lot of different things. So this whole idea that, for example, I could make a statement regarding what we believe as a church that 100% will fall in line with that statement is just incorrect. As a matter of fact, I usually tell people that no matter what we say, half the church is going to be mad. And that's just kind of the reality because we are in so different spectrums of what we believe. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think the idea that you have different points of view in a religious group is a healthy part of what's going on. Should there be some bedrocks and standards and foundational beliefs that we should always have? Absolutely. But the idea that you may have some nuanced thinking that may be a little bit different is not the end of the world from my perspective. And the statement that I make a lot, that if I polled everybody in this room and asked you exactly how you keep the Sabbath, I might find 100 different answers that would come back. And it doesn't mean that we are any less Seventh-day Adventists. It just means that there are sometimes different points of view that you have decided based on your personal relationship with your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. We were talking yesterday among ourselves, and I was telling people, when I was growing up as a child, the only people who really ever worked on the Sabbath were people that worked in the medical profession. If you were a doctor, you were a nurse, you were taking care of somebody, they worked on the Sabbath. Well, today, I know police officers who believe that they're engaging in service to their community, that they believe it's okay to work on the Sabbath. And then there are other people who have different points of view that I may not share, but I don't necessarily look at it as being, quote unquote, anti-Adventist or something that's wrong from their perspective. And I think that's where we have to really find a balance as to how we look at things in order to understand that we can be unified without being uniform. And I think that's the nuance and the balance that we're trying to figure out how to find.
I just wanted to take it back to the local church for a second.
and point out, so we're talking about the judicial, and we were talking about the Supreme Court specifically there. It is, we have not done our job effectively if it gets to Todd's desk, as far as, do you know what I mean? Like, as local church, right? When the individual, first of all, because for one reason, I mean, we know Todd's going to take care of it. And so, it's not going to go beyond Todd, right? But how much time and energy and money has been spent on whatever the issue is before it ever reaches the Supreme Court? And so the conversations about church members being aware of their own religious freedom rights, or the religious freedom rights of their community members, right, their friends and family, and for the pastor to be able to, is always the first line of defense for Sabbath accommodation. Well, if that doesn't work out, then we move to the union, right? And if that doesn't work out, then we move to the conference. At the same time, when we're talking about legislation or rights, that is a congressional responsibility, right? We shouldn't be, and we see, when it does go to the judicial system, not only is there the time and the expense, but then you see these very narrow, or as Bettina was just describing, sort of maybe nebulous, that then allow for a potential negative expansion happen. And so we are all working together, from the local church member to the conference, to the union, to the division, and then to Todd McFarland.
All right, I'll open the floor for any questions you have for our all-star panel. All right, we'll come over here, and yeah, be sure to get my attention, and I'll go in the order in which I see you.
All right, this is a loaded question. The theme song for the Olympics is Imagine. Imagine no religion. And it seems like the whole world has bought that concept. So, from your experience, how much better off is the world without religion?
Well, I don't think the world is better off without religion, but I also think that the world is better off with the understanding that there are multiple ways in our country that people do celebrate their religion. And one of the things that I will say about the Adventist church that sometimes we don't talk enough about is we don't simply just fight for Seventh-day Adventists. We fight for everyone, because we take on the adage that we need to ensure that there's freedom for all. And in particular, that is more important when you are one of the smaller religions in a particular area. When you hang around among Adventists, you kind of have this thought that we're this kind of big behemoth organization in the United States. And, I always kind of grab a line that Todd always uses, is that we punch above our weight class because of all the institutions that we have. When people think about our healthcare institutions, which is probably second largest behind the Catholics, or our academic institutions, which is second largest probably behind the Catholics as well. But the reality is, in the United States, there's probably about 1 million Adventists. But in the United States, there's probably about 8 million Mormons. There's probably around 7 million Methodists. There are probably around 8 million Lutheran. There's probably 30 million Southern Baptists. There's probably 90 million Catholic. And our number is what? 1 million Americans that are Seventh-day Adventists. So if you believe that you can fight a religious fight and you want to fight it in your own concentric circle on your own, you will find out that you will be in a very, very tough situation very quickly. So the idea is not to be able to go out and say, well, we want to promote other religions. The idea is to go out and say that all religions should be treated fairly and their beliefs should be treated fairly, because we probably will benefit more from that type of dialogue than some of the bigger ones that would simply say, well, let's all just raise our hands and vote, because I can assure you if everybody raises their hand and vote, Friday night sundown to Sabbath sundown probably is not going to win. And so that's why it's so important that, and some people are very uncomfortable with the fact that why should we fight the fight for other religious groups? Well, it's because that is a dialogue that actually is beneficial to us as well.
Just real quickly, and I'm going to take you guys' questions. I think a lot of this can be explained, the difference between, say, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution, the Catholic Church, or the dominant church at the time, was very much on the side of the monarchy. It stood in the way of the freedoms and liberty, and it needed to be knocked down, quite frankly, along with the monarchy, because it was, one on one. In the American Revolution, you didn't see that, right? The religious institutions, it was more pluralistic, and they were not defending the crown. And I think that's why what the current environment is so dangerous is if people view, I've got to get religion before I can have my sexual orientation or even my gender identity or racial equality or pick or whatever it is, then they're not just going to move for that, they're going to try to destroy that institution as well. Now, that does not mean that we as religious institutions change our beliefs. But what it does mean is we have to think about where is the line between us having the religious freedom and imposing our religious beliefs, say, for instance, the meaning of the definition of marriage on other people. And as Melissa corrected herself, I about came out of the seat when you said the church didn't have a stance on same-sex marriage. We do have one, but what Melissa was referring to was in Obergefell, which was the case. We said, listen, you, the government, how you choose to define marriage, that's a governmental decision. For us in our church, we will define it as this, and we will continue to do so. And that, I think, is a line that we drew appropriately back in 2015. But that's a fine line, and not everyone in the church, quite frankly, even agrees with that. There are people that think that, God created this institution, it should be reflected in the law. And there are certain beliefs that are in the Bible, we absolutely agree. Thou shalt not murder, perfectly fine for the state of Idaho to have a statute against murder. But you got to ask yourself, where is that line, and where do we have that? So yes.
Thank you. For those of us in the medical field, we're you talked about sex change procedures. We're starting to be pressured to partake in those procedures. I'm an anesthesiologist. As a provider, how would you navigate that? And also as a shareholder in a group that contracts with the hospital, how would you navigate that?
So it was kind of hard to hear. I think the question had to do with the providers. So generally speaking, these are brand new issues. So historically, where this had mostly come down was the issue of abortion. But because of things called the Church Amendment, named after a senator, not churches, and others, and the fact that just the realism of where abortions happen, people, if you were working for some place that provided abortions, that was your choice, right? Now we see reproductive rights expanding. We also see in the trans issues, the general line that I think we've sort of, or at least, and this is all subject to change, is first of all, there's a difference between emergency care and transitioning care. So I think anything that has to do with an emergency care that has to happen, I think, that's going to be very hard to say, well, my religious beliefs, are going to supersede your right to live. The Catholic Church, by the way, takes that position. It is their position that if you have, a Catholic hospital should not prefer the life of a mother over the life of a fetus, and if that means the mother dies, well, that's unfortunate, but that they're religious beliefs. And that's a very tough thing to sell to a judge and to a court. I think when it comes to elective issues and so forth, I think there's a lot more freedom there to say the person gets to have the treatment, they get to have what they want because that's their choice, but you need to find someone else that does this and is comfortable with it. And, we could spend the rest of the day here talking about all the nuances and details and regulations, but just at the maybe not 30,000, but 10,000 foot level, I think that's where we would have the line. On the side of a business and being a shareholder of a larger group, I think that's going to be something that person has to come to a personal opinion on. And, are you willing to do that? What's happening? And also, even though transitioning, and we may not agree that a person should do that, is that something, especially when it's being done by adults, is that something that, is so morally reprehensible that you want to have nothing to do with it, even if you don't agree with it?
Todd, I have a follow-up question for you, which is, would you agree then, but that the way that society is moving, that we're going to see these challenges? Right now you're saying you're good rights-wise, right? As far as you should feel comfortable. But don't you think that this is the direction in which we're moving and that this is going to be experienced? Because again, talking about sort of the mood of the nation and the intolerance for any other perspective except for your own, right? Like before, we used to have this plurality of viewpoints, and, I may not agree with, your view on gun rights or the environment or whatever, but to each his own, right? And we are no longer in that place anymore, right? So
No, we are in a Puritan time frame, right, where there's one truth, one belief, and if you deviate from that, then you must be cast out into utter darkness.
Mine is a bit of a multi-layered question. First, I wanted to clarify for the religious liberty part of it in the beginning. Are you guys advocating for being able to choose whether to hire or not hire people based on their religious beliefs?
So it depends on who the employer is. Sorry, this thing is right in the way. So for a non-religious employer, then absolutely not. Religion should not play a part, and you have to not only do that, you must accommodate. For a religious employer, whether it be Adventist, Catholic, Mormon, pick your favorite, religion, then no, they get to choose for their ecclesiastical organizations, their religious organizations, who they hire and who they don't. So it depends on who the employer is.
Okay. My kind of question with that is to pretty much since Seventh-day Adventists are considered a minority in the sense of most religions involve Sunday keeping, with that kind of ability to choose not to hire someone if they choose not to worship on Sunday, what's to keep that from snowballing into we can choose whether or not to sell or let you buy based on keeping Sunday?
So I think the difference is who the organization is, right? So if you're working for, a Catholic organization like the diocese or whatever, right? Or other explicitly religious organization, as part of their mission and as part of their belief system, by the way, the Catholics have very nuanced ideas on this, I'm just using this as an example, then they have the right to hire people for their organization that align with their beliefs, right? Because that furthers their mission. And the reason is by drawing this line for a religious organization that is, and again, doing their religious activities, that's a small enough part of the economy that there's plenty of other jobs out there for people. Because, so for instance, the General Conference headquarters, we hire IT people, we hire building people. We believe all of those admins, we believe all of those positions and those people there have to be or need to be aligned with us in our beliefs to further the mission. However, and we've taken Muslim cases, we've taken Jewish cases. That doesn't mean if you're an IT person, there aren't other jobs. And, one of the cases the Adventist Church advocated on was a case called EEOC versus Abercrombie & Fitch. And that's where an Abercrombie & Fitch kids store didn't want to hire Samantha Eloff because she was wearing a hijab. And the Adventist Church advocated on that, played a very important role, I believe, in the Supreme Court taking that case, again, behind the scenes, and they ruled 9-0 for the EOC and Samantha Eloff. So that's where it is. I understand what you're saying, but I think there's a very clear line between a religious organization and a secular one that we can make.
All right, thank you. Right over here.
I think many in the church felt that the COVID thing was kind of a dress rehearsal for eschatologically speaking. The church is forced to close. There was some talk about passports so that you could show you had a vaccine so you could go to Walmart and buy something, that sort of thing. And there were a lot of folks, I think, in Idaho that were really surprised that the church folded so quickly here and shut down. And I'm just kind of curious as to what is the criteria that the church ought to have or does have with regards to following what the government says to do. And is that kind of a slippery slope that little by little we'll get to the place where it would come to the final decision, there's no decision to make. And then secondly, after COVID, major corporations and businesses were sitting around boardrooms and committees and talking about the impact of COVID. and what it had on businesses. Some businesses decided cut way back on brick and mortar. Those kinds of impacts. They were making decisions, business decisions, based upon what had happened for the last 2 years. My question is, second question is, what is the Adventist Church doing to reevaluate where we are, how we're behaving, how we're conducting church, how we're doing the business of the gospel to the world in the light of COVID? And what changes should we be looking at, and what would help us to survive something like this better in the future?
Well, let me start off with a few things on that. One of the issues that we were dealing with is the idea that it's not like the church had a whole lot of what I would call experience managing through pandemics. Obviously, we had something we were dealing with back in the early 1900s, but so much of what we were doing, in particular with COVID, was really learning on the fly. And now the slippery slope point that you have made, I think, is a very valid point, but there were a lot of the battles that we were working on in terms of ensuring that, whatever was happening, that from a religious perspective, we would be treated fairly. Give you a perfect example. I was fortunate enough to sit on the governor's task force in the state of Maryland regarding the opening and closing of houses of worship. One of the issues that we ended up getting changed in the state was when you can come to a conclusion that liquor stores and gambling casinos can be open, but churches can be closed, that's a problem. And so one of the things that we had to do was to not necessarily say that we don't think anything should be open at a certain point or close at a certain point, but the question was, how do we make sure we're all treated equally? So if you can have 25 in a liquor store, you should be able to have 25 in a church. If you can be open at this time as it relates to this particular area, then you have to explain to us why it can't be happening from this particular area. We ended up even having houses of worship and also the work of ministers being viewed as part of essential services when it was all said and done. But when the conversation verse gets started, and believe it or not, there's kind of like always this thought process that someone is coming for the church. The reality is most of the time they're not even thinking about the church. And the ideas of what's important to us, which is why our voices are so essential to be out there. I mean, I'm on this task force saying, why are you opening liquor stores and closing churches? And everybody's looking at me like, we ain't really think about that. We just thought about, churches were not as important. How come a pastor's work is not an essential service at a time where we're in the midst of a pandemic? No, we really didn't think about that. But now that we have, let's start making some modifications moving forward. So I think basically, the word I think we use more in our work is balance and nuance. And those are the two phrases that you really have to work on a regular basis, because on one hand, you're getting these reports as to what we should be doing from a health protections perspective. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that you are not just falling in line with something where government could be causing you to do something where you have to be standing up as it relates to your religious freedom. But then that has to be balanced from a safety perspective. And then even when you look at it, COVID was operating differently in many different states. There was some conferences and organizations that ended up opening back up quicker than other churches and conferences because of what the statistics were in terms of how COVID was impacting certain places. COVID in a wide open place like Idaho is very different than COVID in New York City, where they got into a point where they couldn't even find enough morgues to deal with the number of people who were dying there. And so when you're trying to manage through and make rulings that is covering across a multi-jurisdictional, multi-denominational, multi-geopolitical, everything, it becomes very difficult. And what we ended up doing in large part, I think, was we ended up getting more into allowing regions to view things a little bit differently based on the information that we were getting from the region. So trying to find that balance was very, very difficult, but I think trying to make sure that we were ensuring that churches would not be treated, in a way that they would be what I would call discriminated against based on being a religious organization. So I think that's part of it. But the issue regarding watching out for the slippery slope, everybody talked about that. And everybody was looking at that, and everybody was trying to figure out how to balance that properly.
if I can, I know to some extent it seemed like, especially from the litigation perspective, that the GC NAD wasn't really doing anything. And I think we were monitoring this from the beginning. The other reality is, so for a church, local church does not have the authority to bring a lawsuit against the county and so forth. That would have to go through the conference. Actually, it would have to be voted at the division level. You know how many requests we got the entire COVID time from a conference to challenge a local health rule for a church? The answer is 0. We did not have a single conference call us up and say, hey, and as Orland said, there was a huge disparity. There were parts, I mean, I remember I went down to Tennessee to visit some friends in May of 2020, end of May, left Maryland. It was just, as I was driving south, it was just amazing how things change. And you go down there, if you wanted to go to church, there were places, that you could. And so I think that's also from an organizational perspective was that the places that wanted to open up early, generally speaking, in a macro from the church, were able to. And then there were other congregations and other conferences that stayed closed much longer than legally required to. And so I think that was also, from an institutional perspective, sort of what we were looking at. And then eventually the Supreme Court, of course, made its decision in New York. And then from a legal perspective, the church openings that issue went away. And that was, I think, in 21 they made that. So, but yeah, it's a tough call, and I think everyone was struggling how to figure that out and where the balance was.
And from a union director's perspective, in the Southern Union, of course, we're a heavily populated area in the Southeast, and I had many members call and complain that their churches were closed. But then I had many members and pastors who were calling and saying, we have made lemonade out of this lemon. And I had people calling me, they were happy. They felt like the Lord had blessed them. They were serving their community. They hadn't had church in the sanctuary in 3 months, but every single week they had people come into their church. And so how we deal with crisis is very often dependent upon the personality that individuals in our church have and the personality of your church, your local church. And I noticed that the places where I got the most complaints were where the members only wanted to go to church. They were upset that they couldn't go to church physically. And the places where I had the most joyous reports were the places where the members were worshiping a different way, but serving their community in a way that was far bigger than they had ever served their communities before. And so, again, when life gives you a lemon, make some lemonade, And I had so many churches that were doing that, so many people coming back and saying, I hate this pandemic. I would never wish it on us again. We don't like being closed, but we're not going to let Satan divide us, and we're not going to let Satan stop the ministry that we have in our community. And there were lots of ways people were doing that.
Amen. All right, we got the last 2 questions. We're going to go over here and then over here.
Yeah, there was a famous church in California. I think the reason I remember the name, it was Maxwell, not an Adventist, but it was a Maxwell was the pastor. And they were determined to stay open during COVID. Did our Religious Liberty Apartment, did you join in helping them, or what was your stance on that one? That's part A. And then a follow-up to his question regarding our medical people. I got the sense from talking to our doctors and nurses in St. Al's and St. Luke's during COVID that they were not free, that they could not practice medicine the way they wanted to, that these big organizations had pretty well locked down what they could say and what they could do as far as treatment. In fact, one doctor who had retired during that time said one of the reasons he retired, got out of medicine, was he had no freedom. I mean, what has been your role in that for our medical people who are part of these mammoth organizations now who are controlled? They're bought and paid for, That's where their check is coming from. They aren't independent like they used to.
So I think two things. First of all, the short answer to your question about that particular church is the Adventist church took no particular role in there. We weren't asked to represent him. I don't know that we would have had he asked. And so, we did not take a stance on that, which I wouldn't be apologetic for. There was a lot going on in that church. There were, like I said, the reality is people were dying. Coming back to the other question, people said it felt like it was a rehearsal for end times. If that's your case as far as public control, I think it was a complete failure. Just looking at it from a macroscopic perspective, almost every requirement in the United States, as opposed to other countries, ended up just breaking down. Churches were going back immediately. The show me your papers, masks. I mean, again, whether you agree with this or not, the airlines wanted mask requirement put in by the FAA when, during the 45 administration, right? Biden comes in, they put it in. Eventually, they had so much trouble with it, a single judge in Florida struck it down, and the White House and the FAA didn't even appeal it. They were so happy to go. The public health authorities, for better or worse in this country, have lost all credibility. And if we had another pandemic now, their ability to sort of put these social controls in and so forth, I think, at least in the United States, has been greatly compromised. And so I think from that perspective, it was, as far as social control. Now, other places, like her home country, that would be Australia, it was a complete different experience, right? They literally put drones up, and if you were talking to your neighbor over the thing, $10,000 fine. Now, it's Australian dollars, so it's not that much. But I'm sorry. But anyway, so I'm sorry, that was...
That was uncalled for.
That was.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Bettina, I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
There seems to be so much more government involvement in our religious affairs these days, and I just wonder if we could hear a very clear definition of the separation of church and state. And is that definition perhaps evolved from its original intent?
Oh. Todd will start his legal meter.
No, you go on.
Go ahead, Bettina.
Original intent is an interesting proposition, and it really is the direction in which the Supreme Court is moving in terms of its interpretation of many constitutional questions. It's tricky for many reasons, not least because 250 years ago in 1791, when the First Amendment was drafted, you have to remember that the drafters of that amendment were a group of white landowning men who were operating within a very specific socio and political framework, and they were putting in place measures that were intended, frankly, not to benefit the majority of the then population of America, which was enslaved men and women, indigenous Americans, and women generally. So original intent, I think, is it's going to prove a very tricky road for the courts to follow. And I think we are already seeing that in the confusion in the lower courts surrounding constitutional law questions, where the lower courts are trying to implement this idea of original intent in place of the more familiar tiers of scrutiny, which we've operated under for the past number of decades. So there's that issue. Separation of church and state, a very clear and concise definition. If I had that, I would be famous. But I would say it's simply this. Religion flourishes best when the government cannot put its thumb on the scale in terms of religious questions. The government flourishes best when religion cannot put its thumb on the scale regarding questions of state. Now, you can argue those lines and where they're drawn, and that's what the courts are for. That's what we do in the courts, and it's a constantly evolving process. But I think for us as Seventh-day Adventists, we have a certain prophetic outlook that determines, our macro view of these questions. And it's a prophetic outlook that says, at some point down the track, America will be not a friend to liberty in many ways. And we need to not buy in to the current ideas that are floating around that say that a more Christianized America is going to be a benefit to religion. I think ultimately we know through our prophetic understanding that that is a fallacy. That said, we have to recognize that establishment clause, separation of church and state is often used these days in a way that is hostile to religion. We're not oblivious to that. We understand that. And so, again, the path that we are trying to walk is a middle path. And it's a path that not many religious denominations are walking. But we have a unique message to give. We are uniquely placed to give this message. And I think we can bring that balance to the discussion of these issues, and that's what we're trying to do.
Orlin, bring us home.
Thing to that. There are a number of areas that you find the government reaching their hands into that the reason that sometimes they had to is because the churches were handling things in a poor way. And sometimes there's a certain power, like, for example, even things like, like divorce. There was a time that I don't think the government would have ever wanted to be involved in some of these type of activities, but when the church kind of failed in how they were, quote unquote, doing their roles, and they looked like they were almost putting their thumb on, and there would be one group of individuals who seemed to benefit more than another group of individuals, then what ends up happening is sometimes the government finds itself having to come in and play referee in certain instances. The other thing is that as a church body, we have to be cautious in making sure that we're living our lives in a way where we don't look like we're using our religious power as a sword as opposed to using it as a shield. Right. The idea that we get to, quote unquote, have certain protections, and to some degree, what we are also given is the power to discriminate. And when we utilize that power, we have to use it in what I would call in a way in which we are being more like the lamb and the dove as opposed to being like a lamb, or like a lion and a serpent. So part of how we continue to make sure that we can have what I would call positive reactions as it relates to what goes on from a church perspective as it relates to separation of church and state is ensuring that we as a church are operating in a way where we are being what I would call a very positive citizen in society and how we go about doing what we do. And when we get the opportunities to protect ourselves and our religious beliefs, that we don't use that same opportunity to use that as a club to beat other people. And I think as we go through the process and finding that right balance, I think it's important. The Establishment Clause piece, I think, is always going to be critical because that's how you really have the protection to make sure the Congress isn't, making any laws that basically is going to be putting pressure on a religion or therefore creating its own religion in some form or fashion. So to me, that part we have to protect because that protects more what I would call smaller religious groups more than anything else. But we also, in my opinion, have to remember that when you get these opportunities, because remember, when we get certain opportunities, the rest of society looks at those opportunities and say, we don't think they should have gotten that. So part of the question is how do you utilize it when you get it to make sure that you're obviously looking to protect individuals and not harm individuals with those powers.
I was doing a Q&A religious liberty panel, well, actually one-person panel, in the Washington conference, and the question came up very similar to yours, because I talked about all these kind of package of things that parole directors do, and he asked, just in one sentence, what is it that a religious liberty leader does? What do you do? And I thought about it, and I said, you know what? Here it is. I fight government overreach. That's what we do. Will you please thank our panel for their time today?
He said he fights government overreach.
I just want to close with this. We heard Wendy's children's story today that we're all citizens of heaven. We're all children of God. And from the divisive nature that we have in our discourse, in our culture, I want to leave you with Ephesians chapter 4. And these are the words of Paul. I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. Be completely humble, gentle, patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you are called, one hope, and one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and through all. May we walk in the manner worthy of the calling that we've received as children of God and Seventh-day Adventist Christians. Father in heaven, we thank you for being with us in our discussion. We ask that you bless the members and the leaders of this church and the mission that it carries out in the Treasure Valley. And we also ask your blessing and your continued guidance and wisdom on us as religious liberty leaders, that we'll continue to carry on the mission of your church throughout North America and throughout the world. We thank you for the rest that we're receiving for this Sabbath day. Go with us now as we part ways, and that we will remember that all the blessings that we receive come from your hand. We thank you and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. We have had a blessed week at our meetings here in Boise. Cloverdale, thank you for your hospitality today.